There's a narrative in the Old Testament that, to be honest, I consider to be the most disturbing in the entire Bible, and one that may not be suitable for younger audiences. Before we proceed with this video, it is crucial that you are aware that its content is not suitable for all ages and may evoke disturbing memories from your past. The story I'm referring to is recorded in chapters 19 and 21 of the Book of Judges. Although many people are familiar with chapter 19, few explore the full narrative. I firmly believe that there are several crucial lessons that both you and I can draw from such an impactful story. First, I'll present the narrative in dramatic form, and then I'll examine the lessons I think are pertinent. I invite you to join me in chapter 19 of Judges, where the story unfolds. In the days when there was no monarch in Israel, a Levite who lived in a remote region of the mountains of Ephraim acquired a woman from Bethlehem in Judah to be his concubine. It's important to understand that this Levite man lives in the far north of Israel, while the woman, who can be considered his concubine or wife, is settled in the south, in Bethlehem. The story continues with her being unfaithful and leaving him to return to her father's house in Bethlehem, where she stays for a few months. Later, she betrays him and returns to her father's house in Bethlehem. The Levite, wishing to recover his wife, undertakes a journey from the north, from the mountains of Ephraim, to the south, in Bethlehem, with the aim of reconciling with her. When he gets there, the woman's father shows great hospitality, repeatedly postponing the Levite's departure, despite his request to return with his wife. This situation continues for several days, until the Levite respectfully insists on his departure. So they set off back home, from the south of Bethlehem to the north in Ephraim. During the journey, when they were close to Jebus and the day was about to end, the servant suggested to his master that they stop in the city of Jebus to spend the night. However, his master refused the idea, preferring not to stop in a foreign city where there were no Israelites, deciding to continue on to Gibeah. Then the servant said, "Let's try to reach one of these places and spend the night in Gibeah or Ramah." So they continued on their journey, and the sun set as they approached Gibeah in Benjamin. When they got there, to their surprise, they found no one willing to welcome them into their homes. Hospitality was an essential value in Israelite culture. However, late at night, an old man appeared in the square and asked why they were still there, unwelcomed. When the travelers answered no, the old man invited them to spend the night at his house in Gibeah. The Levite, his servant, and his concubine accepted the old man's invitation. As they entered the house, the Levite made it clear that they didn't need much, just a place to rest their heads and a pillow. The old man gladly agreed to offer them shelter. So the Levite, his servant, and his concubine spent the night in the old man's house in Gibeah. However, while they were there, enjoying his hospitality, something terrible happened. Suddenly, wicked men from the city surrounded the house and knocked on the door. They demanded that the owner of the house hand over the man who was staying there so that they could have sex with him. This is when the story takes a dark turn. The perverted men, inhabitants of Gibeah, went to the owner of the house and insisted that he hand over his guest to satisfy their lustful desires. However, the owner of the house refused to allow such an atrocity. Instead, he offered his virgin daughter and the man's concubine to be abused by them, asking them not to commit this horrible cruelty against the guest. We'll touch on this a little later in this video, but what follows is truly unimaginable. In verse 25, it is reported that despite their pleas, the man would not listen. So he grabbed his concubine and took her outside, where they raped and abused her all night until dawn. At dawn, they let her go. That's why I mentioned that this video may be considered unsuitable for minors and may bring up memories from your past. Imagine the situation: a group of perverted men taking turns to sexually assault this woman, perpetrating these horrendous acts throughout the night until the morning, when they finally let her go. This is the sad fate that awaits her. The next morning, the woman returns, and at daybreak collapses on the doorstep of the man's house where her master was. So exhausted, so beaten, so abused throughout the night, she barely has the strength to crawl back to his house and simply lies down on the porch. Now watch what happens next. The master, getting up in the morning, opens the doors of the house and goes out to continue his journey, finding the woman, his concubine, lying by the door, her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said to her. "Let's go." But there was no response. The woman had been so brutally abused that she died. Note that it is recorded that the man put her on his donkey and left for home. Now, what happens next is extremely sad and horrible. It is said that on entering his house, he took a knife, held his concubine, and cut her into 12 pieces, limb by limb. He then sent these pieces all over Israel. Everyone who witnessed this act was astonished, having never seen or heard anything like it since the day the Israelites left Egypt until that moment. This is a point for reflection, a subject for discussion. This man took his concubine home and divided her into 12 pieces, no doubt attaching a letter to each piece of her inert body. He sent a different piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel, explaining in detail what he had done. This was done by his own brothers, belonging to the tribe of Benjamin. When the other tribes learned what had happened to this woman, they were shocked. Nothing like this had happened in all of history up to that point. There is much more to the narrative, as we will see in chapter 21. However, it is at this point that we should begin to draw some lessons that we can learn from this story. The first is this: when there is no responsibility in our lives, we have a strong tendency to stray from the path. As noted in Judges chapter 19, verse 1, when there is no king in Israel, we, you and I, don't feel the need to be accountable. In the absence of the fear of being held accountable for our decisions and actions, we are more inclined to make bad choices, believing that we can act on our own, without having to answer to anyone. This is exactly the scenario that was unfolding in Israel. There was no king, but there was a law. Yet people weren't respecting it, and it wasn't being enforced. As a result, they ended up doing something they probably never imagined they would do. The second lesson I'd like to address is the importance of treating every human being as an image bearer of God. Here is a man who expressed, "It would be wrong for you to do what you want with this man, but you can do what you want with my daughter and his concubine." His mentality was that this man's life and dignity were worth more than that of his own daughter and his concubine. We need to make sure, when watching inappropriate content online, that we don't get involved in it. If you want to stop watching things online that you know you shouldn't be watching, you need to consider how every person you see on the screen is an image bearer of God, someone like your daughter. Imagine if someone looked at your daughter doing what you're seeing on the screen. The third thing I want to highlight in this video is that the further we move away from God, the more vulnerable we become to doing things we never imagined we would do. When we look at the book of Judges as a whole, we see a nation that has slowly turned away from God. What happens in chapters 19 to 21 is the culmination of this turning away, showing how far the nation as a whole has distanced itself from God. We are no different, because if we don't maintain a close connection with God, if we turn away or go astray, we will end up doing things we never imagined we would do. The story doesn't end in chapter 19, and I wish it would, but it actually gets worse, because what happens in chapter 20 is a civil war between the 11 tribes of Israel and the tribe of Benjamin. They are fighting against the tribe of Benjamin because it was the tribe that committed this horrendous act of sin against one of their own Israelite brothers. I would encourage you to read chapters 20 and 21 carefully. In short, there was a huge battle in which thousands of lives were lost on both sides, resulting in only 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin. In chapter 21, the other 11 tribes begin to feel compassion for the tribe of Benjamin, fearing their extinction due to the scarcity of women to marry and procreate. This raises the concern that one of the 12 tribes of Israel will disappear. This brings us to my fourth lesson. Every bad decision has consequences we can't choose. Although the Benjamites' actions were wrong, the other 11 tribes fighting and killing them was a decision they made, and now they have to face the consequences. In the same way, the Benjamites also suffer the consequences of their choices. It is essential to understand that we can choose our sin, but we cannot choose its consequences. The problem is that we can't choose those consequences. Next, the Israelites kill men from the clan of Jabesh Gilead and offer the women to the Benjamites. However, there are still 200 men of Benjamin left without wives. They then decide to send a message to the Benjamites to kidnap the women during a nearby festival, circumventing their previous oath not to give their daughters in marriage. The 200 Benjamite men follow this advice and steal the women during the festival. I recognize that this is a complex story, and I've tried to summarize it as best I can. The key point is that one bad decision often leads to another, negatively affecting several people. Many of the Benjamite men suffered the consequences, although some deserved it, while other innocent people died in the battle, including women from Jabesh Gilead. However, God's grace manifests itself even in the midst of our most destructive decisions. The book of Judges ends with the note that, in those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what seemed right to them. Although God was gracious in allowing the tribe of Benjamin to be rebuilt, the consequences remain. Every decision we make has implications, often immeasurable and uncontrollable. I hope this reflection helps you understand the complexity of decisions and their consequences. Until the next video, God bless you.